On October 15, 1888, the town of Fort Smith, Arkansas, witnessed something that would haunt its residents for generations. A wedding ceremony between 45-year-old Nathaniel Decker and 22-year-old Rose Sullivan took place just 3 months after the mysterious hunting accident that claimed the life of William Decker, Nathaniel's own son and Rose's original fiancé. Like a grieving father offering protection to his deceased son's bride, was actually the culmination of the most calculated and sinister love affair in Sebastian County's history. The couple's passionate conspiracy involved 3 failed murder attempts, systematic poisoning, and ultimately a cold-blooded execution, disguised as hunting mishap. Local records carefully hidden in the Sebastian County courthouse basement for over a century, reveal a trail of evidence that authorities deliberately ignored and witnesses who mysteriously disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances whenever they spoke too freely about what they had seen. Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Decker and the woman who helped him murder his own flesh and blood, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this tale of forbidden desire and family betrayal will make you question everything you thought you knew about the lengths people will go to for love. The truth about what really happened in those Arkansas lumber camps had been buried along with William Decker, but the evidence was always there for those brave enough to look. Sebastian County in 1888 stood as one of Arkansas's most prosperous regions, built on the wealth flowing from its vast timber industry and the bustling river trade along the Arkansas River. Fort Smith, the county seat, had grown from a frontier military post into a thriving commercial center where lumber barons, cattle ranchers, and river merchants competed for dominance in the rapidly expanding post-Civil War economy. Nathaniel Decker had arrived in Sebastian County 15 years earlier, an ambitious young man from Tennessee with enough capital to purchase a failing sawmill and the vision to transform it into the largest lumber operation between Little Rock and the Indian Territory. Decker Lumber Company employed over 200 men and controlled thousands of acres of prime timberland in the Ozark foothills. The sound of Nathaniel's steam-powered saws echoed through the Arkansas River Valley from dawn to dusk, and his lumber supplied construction projects as far away as Kansas City and New Orleans. At 45, Nathaniel cut an imposing figure in Fort Smith society. Standing 6 feet tall with steel gray hair and penetrating blue eyes, he commanded respect through a combination of business acumen and carefully cultivated charm. His late wife Margaret had died of consumption 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their only son William, then 23, and already showing signs of the weak constitution that had plagued the Decker men for generations. William Decker represented everything his father both loved and despised about his own bloodline. The young man possessed his father's intelligence and his mother's gentle nature, but he lacked the ruthless drive that had built the family fortune. Opportunity. William saw obligation where his father demanded results. William preferred compromise. At 26, William managed the lumber company's bookkeeping and customer relations, tasks that kept him safely away from the dangerous machinery and demanding physical labor that his father believed built character. The lumber camps themselves sprawled across the heavily forested hills east of Fort Smith, connected to the main mill by a network of narrow-gauge railroad tracks that carried massive logs down to the Arkansas River. These camps housed a rough collection of loggers, many of them Irish and German immigrants who had fled the industrial cities of the North, seeking work in America's expanding frontier. They lived in crude bunkhouses, worked 6 days a week in conditions that claimed several lives each year, and spent their Saturday nights drinking and gambling in the taverns of Fort Smith's notorious River District. It was into this masculine world of sawdust, sweat, and sudden death that Rose Sullivan arrived on a crisp September morning in 1888, stepping off the Paddle Here Memphis Belle with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction from William Decker. Rose had been born in County Cork, Ireland, but her family had immigrated to Boston when she was 7 years old. Her father, Patrick Sullivan, worked as a dock laborer until tuberculosis claimed him when Rose was 15. On sewing to support Rose and her 2 younger brothers, but the family struggled constantly against poverty and the anti-Irish prejudice that pervaded Boston's employment practices. Marriage broker approached Bridget Sullivan in the summer of 1888 with news that a prosperous Arkansas businessman sought a suitable Irish wife for his son. The family saw it as divine providence. William Decker had placed his requirements through a series of Catholic parish networks. A young woman of good character, devout faith, practical skills who would be willing to travel west for marriage to a successful lumber heir. Rose possessed all these qualities, but she also carried something that had not been requested, a fierce intelligence and an ambitious spirit that chafed against the limited opportunities available to Irish immigrant women in 1880s America. She had already worked as a seamstress, a shop girl, and a tutor for wealthy Protestant families who paid her less than they paid their stable boys. The prospect of marrying a lumber company heir represented not just escape from poverty, but entry into a social class that had always been denied to people of her background. Her journey to Arkansas took 3 weeks, traveling by train to New York, then by riverboat down the Mississippi to the Arkansas River. William had sent money for first-class accommodations along with detailed letters describing his family, his business, and his hopes for their future together. His correspondence revealed a gentle, thoughtful young man who wrote poetry, collected books, and dreamed of expanding the family business into furniture manufacturing. But when Rose arrived in Fort Smith and met her intended husband at the Riverside Depot, she felt the first stirring of disappointment that would ultimately lead to tragedy. William Decker was exactly as he had described himself in his letters: kind, educated, financially secure, and utterly unremarkable. Greeted her with nervous politeness, helped her into his family's finest carriage, and spent the ride to their home apologizing for the dust, the heat, and the rough appearance of the lumber workers they passed along the road. Decker Mansion stood on Garrison Avenue, Fort Smith's most prestigious residential street, a 3-story Victorian home with wraparound porches, ornate gingerbread trim, and manicured gardens that showcase the family's prosperity. Servants took Rose's belongings to the guest quarters, where she would stay until the wedding scheduled for October 20th, just 6 weeks away. It was at dinner that first evening that Rose met Nathaniel Decker, and her carefully planned future began to unravel. The Decker family dining room epitomized the refined luxury that Timberwolf wealth could purchase in 1888. Arkansas. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furniture imported from New Orleans, while oil paintings of pastoral scenes decorated walls covered in rich burgundy wallpaper. The table itself could seat 12 guests comfortably. On this particular September evening, only 3 play settings had been arranged on the crisp white linen tablecloth. Nathaniel entered the dining room precisely at 7 o'clock, as was his custom, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding height. Rose, who had been making polite conversation with William about his book collection, felt her breath catch as she watched Nathaniel move with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his every word obeyed. "Rose Sullivan," William said, rising from his chair with the nervous energy that seemed to characterize all his movements. "Rose, this is my father, Nathaniel Decker." Nathaniel took Rose's offered hand in both of his, holding it a moment longer than propriety demanded, while his blue eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Miss Sullivan, he said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of authority. William's letters hardly did justice to your beauty. Welcome to our home. The compliment was inappropriate. A father should not comment so directly on his son's fiancée's appearance, but Rose found herself drawn to the boldness of it. After years of interacting with men who treated her as either a servant or a charity case, Nathaniel's direct appreciation felt like recognition of her worth as a woman, rather than merely her utility as a wife. Dinner, Rose found herself stealing glances at Nathaniel while William discussed his plans for their honeymoon trip to New Orleans. The father commanded the conversation without effort, sharing stories of his business dealings, his opinions on Arkansas politics, and his experiences building an empire from nothing. About the challenges of managing 200 employees and thousands of acres of timberland, Rose heard the confidence of a man who shaped the world according to his will. To shrink in his father's presence, he offered tentative opinions that he immediately qualified with phrases like, "Of course I could be wrong," or, "Perhaps father sees it differently." When Nathaniel asked about production figures from the main sawmill, William fumbled through his explanation, clearly nervous about making any statement that might contradict his father's expectations. "You must understand, Miss Sullivan," Nathaniel said, as dessert was served, "that William has many fine qualities, but business requires a certain ruthlessness that doesn't come naturally to him. He's too gentle for his own good." The comment was delivered with apparent affection, but Rose detected the steel beneath Nathaniel's words. Man who recognized weakness even in his own son and felt no hesitation in exposing it. After dinner, William offered to show Rose the family library, but Nathaniel interrupted. "Perhaps Miss Sullivan would enjoy seeing the timber operations. I'm riding out to Camp 3 tomorrow morning to inspect our new steam donkey. A woman planning to marry into the lumber business should understand where our prosperity originates." William opened his mouth to object. Clearly, he had planned a quiet morning introducing Rose to his poetry collection, but his father's suggestion carried the weight of a command. "Of course," William said weakly, "if Rose would find that interesting." Rose accepted immediately, though she couldn't have explained why. Something about Nathaniel's invitation felt dangerous, and danger had been absent from her carefully circumscribed life for far too long. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the first hints of autumn coloring the oak and maple trees that dotted the hills east of Fort Smith. Rose had dressed in her most practical outfit, a dark blue wool dress with minimal bustle that would allow her to ride side saddle without difficulty. When she arrived at the stables behind the Decker mansion, she found Nathaniel waiting with 2 horses, a gentle mare for her and a powerful stallion for himself. William was nowhere to be seen. "My son sends his regrets," Nathaniel explained as he helped Rose mount her horse. "He received an urgent message from our timber agent in Van Buren, requiring immediate attention. Business, I'm afraid. Waits for no one." Rose accepted this explanation, though something in Nathaniel's tone suggested that William's absence might not have been entirely coincidental. As they rode through the early morning mist toward the timber camps, she found herself studying her companion's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. The ride to Camp 3 took nearly 2 hours, following rutted logging roads that wound through increasingly dense forest. Proved to be an engaging companion, sharing stories about the early days of his lumber operation and pointing out the landmarks that marked the expansion of his holdings over the years. He spoke with genuine passion about the work itself, the satisfaction of felling a magnificent oak that had stood for centuries, the challenge of moving massive logs down treacherous mountain slopes, the pride of transforming raw timber into lumber that would build homes and businesses across the expanding American frontier. Camp 3 occupied a clearing on a hillside overlooking the Arkansas River Valley, a collection of rough wooden buildings surrounded by enormous piles of freshly cut logs. The new steam donkey, a steam-powered winch system for moving logs, stood at the center of the operation, its boiler already fired up and ready for the day's work. Rose had expected to observe from a safe distance while Nathaniel conducted his business, but he insisted on explaining every aspect of the operation. He showed her how the steam donkey's cable system could drag logs weighing several tons up slopes that would be impossible for horses to navigate. He pointed out the careful positioning of the guidelines that prevented the massive logs from breaking free and crushing the workers below. He even allowed her to operate the steam donkey's controls, guiding her hands as she learned to coordinate the throttle and cable release. "You have good instincts," he told her, as she successfully moved a 000 Lee log into position. "Most women would be too frightened to try." "I'm not most women," Rose replied, and immediately regretted the boldness of her response. Nathaniel smiled. "No, you certainly are not." They shared lunch at a rough wooden table outside the camp foreman's office, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee, while Nathaniel reviewed production reports and discussed the next day's cutting schedule with his crew leaders. Rose noticed how the men responded to Nathaniel with respect certainly, but also with the weariness of employees who knew their jobs depended on maintaining their boss's approval. It was during the ride back to Fort Smith that the conversation took a turn that would change everything. "Tell me about your expectations for marriage," Nathaniel said as they paused to rest their horses beside a creek that bubbled through a grove of hickory trees. Rose considered her answer carefully. "I expect to be a good wife, to support my husband's work, and to raise children who will continue the family name." "Those are admirable goals," Nathaniel replied. "Don't tell me what you hope to gain from marriage beyond security and respectability." Rose with its directness. In Boston, no one had ever asked what she hoped to gain from anything. Survival had been goal enough. "I suppose I hope to matter," she said finally, "to be part of something important, something that makes a difference in the world." Nathaniel dismounted and walked to the creek's edge, where he picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface. "And do you believe marriage to William will provide that opportunity?" Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question was inappropriate, potentially scandalous, but she found herself considering it seriously. "William is a good man," she said. "That's not what I asked." Rose dismounted as well, needing to move, to think, to understand why this conversation felt so dangerous and so necessary. "William is gentle and kind and educated. He will provide well for a family and treat his wife with respect and consideration." "Again, not what I asked." Rose turned to face him, noting how his blue eyes seemed to see through all her careful diplomatic responses to the truth. "Beneath?" "No," she said quietly. "I don't believe marriage to William will provide that opportunity. He's content to manage other people's decisions and implement other people's visions. Never build anything himself. And building something matters to you." "Yes." Nathaniel stepped closer, close enough that Rose could smell the scent of pine needles and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Understand my dilemma. I've spent 25 years building something that will die with me because my son lacks the will to continue what I've started." Rose knew she should step back, should remount her horse, and insist they return to Fort Smith immediately. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do you intend to do about that?" Nathaniel's answer came not in words, but in the way his fingers brushed against hers as he helped her back into the saddle. The touch lasted only a moment, but it carried a promise that made Rose's heart race with equal parts anticipation and terror. They rode the rest of the way to Fort Smith in silence, but something fundamental had changed between them. When they arrived at the Decker mansion, William was waiting anxiously on the front porch, having returned from the Burn hours earlier. "How was your ride?" he asked, his relief at their safe return evident in every word. "Educational," Rose replied, and caught Nathaniel's slight smile at her choice of words. That night, as Rose lay in her guest room bed, listening to the settling sounds of the unfamiliar house, she understood that she stood at a crossroads that would determine the entire course of her life. She could marry William as planned, accept the comfortable but limited future he offered, and spend her years wondering what might have been, or she could pursue the dangerous attraction she felt for Nathaniel, knowing that such a path would require choices that would horrify the woman she had been just 24 hours earlier. When sleep finally came, Rose dreamed of steam donkeys and massive logs and the feeling of strong hands guiding hers as she learned to control forces powerful enough to reshape the landscape itself. The weeks following Rose's visit to the timber camp established a routine that would have appeared perfectly innocent to any casual observer, but that slowly, systematically drew her deeper into Nathaniel's orbit. William, pleased with his fiancée's apparent interest in the family business, encouraged what he saw as her practical desire to understand their source of prosperity. He had no way of knowing that each business excursion, each private conversation about lumber operations, each moment Rose spent in his father's company was carefully orchestrated to feed a growing obsession that consumed both participants. Nathaniel found reasons to visit the mansion during the day when William was occupied at the main sawmill. He would arrive with business documents that required immediate attention, architectural plans for new facilities that needed review, or urgent messages from timber agents that couldn't wait for evening. Visits always included invitations for Rose to accompany him on brief errands, inspecting potential mills site locations, reviewing timber quality at the riverside lumber yards, or discussing equipment purchases with machinery dealers who had traveled from as far away as Chicago to court the Decker Lumber Company's business. Rose accepted each invitation with the eager interest of a woman preparing to become part of a business empire. Questions about profit margins and production costs demonstrated remarkable aptitude for understanding the technical aspects of lumber grading and steam-powered equipment, and showed genuine fascination with the strategic challenges of managing such a complex operation. What neither admitted even to themselves during those early days was that the business discussions provided cover for a more intimate form of education. Nathaniel was teaching Rose to see the world through his eyes, to understand power as something that must be seized rather than granted, recognize weakness as a luxury that successful people could not afford, and to appreciate the satisfaction that came from bending circumstances to one's will, rather than merely accepting what fate provided. William has never understood, Nathaniel explained as they rode through timber holdings on a crisp October morning, that in business, as in nature, only the strongest survive. He believes that being fair and reasonable will ensure success, but fairness is a luxury that only winners can afford. Rose found herself nodding at observations that would have appalled her just weeks earlier. "He does seem to assume that other people will act honorably simply because he does." "Exactly. And that assumption will destroy everything I've built unless someone with clearer vision assumes control." The implications of such statements hung in the air between them, never quite spoken aloud, but clearly understood. Nathaniel was not simply sharing business philosophy. He was recruiting a conspirator, testing Rose's willingness to embrace a worldview that placed desire above duty and ambition above morality. Meanwhile, William's own behavior began to change in subtle ways that only heightened the contrast between father and son, perhaps sensing some shift in the dynamics of his household, perhaps responding unconsciously to the tension that crackled in the air whenever the three of them were together. William became increasingly solicitous of Rose's comfort and increasingly deferential to his father's opinions. He began seeking Nathaniel's approval for decisions that should have been his own, asking permission to take Rose on afternoon walks, requesting advice about wedding plans that he should have discussed privately with his fiancée, and constantly qualifying his own preferences with phrases like, "Course father might have a better idea," or "Perhaps we should ask father what he thinks." This difference, intended to demonstrate respect and maintain family harmony, had the opposite effect Rose might have hoped for. Instead of endearing William to her, his constant yielding to paternal authority made him seem weak and indecisive. Where Nathaniel commanded, William requested. Where Nathaniel decided, William deliberated. William hesitated. Rose began to understand viscerally what Nathaniel meant about strength and weakness. She could see how William's gentle nature, so appealing in his letters, translated in person to an inability to claim his own space in the world, even in matters that directly concerned his own wedding. He seemed incapable of asserting preferences that might conflict with anyone else's opinions. The turning point came on October 8th, just 12 days before the scheduled wedding ceremony. William had planned a private picnic for himself and Rose at Ozark Landing, a scenic spot along the Arkansas River where paddle-wheelers stopped to take on timber from the Decker sawmill. Arranged for the cook to prepare a special lunch, had commissioned the groundskeeper to gather autumn flowers for a bouquet, and had even composed a poem that he intended to read while they watched the sunset over the water. But when afternoon came, Nathaniel announced that urgent business required William's immediate attention at the main sawmill. A machinery breakdown threatened to halt production for several days unless repairs could be completed before the next morning's shift. As the person responsible for equipment maintenance schedules, William's presence was essential. "Perhaps you could postpone your picnic until tomorrow," Nathaniel suggested with apparent sympathy for his son's disappointment. William looked stricken. He had clearly been building toward this romantic gesture for days, planning every detail with the meticulous care he brought to all his endeavors. Couldn't the repairs wait until tomorrow morning? The mill supervisor usually handles equipment problems. The mill supervisor is down with fever, Nathaniel replied, and the Chicago machinery dealer who can supply the replacement parts is leaving tomorrow afternoon. If we don't complete the repairs tonight, we'll lose a week of production. Rose watched this exchange with growing understanding of the power dynamics at play. Had not simply requested William's help, he had structured the situation so that refusal would seem irresponsible and selfish. William could choose between his personal desires and his business obligations, but only one choice would meet his father's definition of mature behavior. "Of course," William said, after a moment's hesitation. "Business must come first. Rose will understand." Understood was that William would always choose the path that avoided conflict, even when that meant sacrificing his own happiness and disappointing the woman he claimed to love. "I'm terribly sorry, Rose," William continued, his distress genuine. "We'll have our picnic tomorrow. I promise. The sunset will be just as beautiful." Nathaniel, however, had a different suggestion. "Perhaps Rose would enjoy seeing the mill operations while you're working on the repairs. She's shown such interest in learning about the business, and this would be an excellent opportunity to observe our nighttime procedures." William brightened at this proposal. His father's offer to entertain Rose while he worked seemed like the perfect solution. It demonstrated Nathaniel's kindness while ensuring that Rose wouldn't spend the evening alone and disappointed. "Would you mind terribly, Rose?" William asked. "Father knows the mill operations better than anyone, and you did say you wanted to understand every aspect of the lumber business." Rose agreed with apparent enthusiasm, though her real excitement had nothing to do with learning about sawmill procedures. She was beginning to recognize Nathaniel's manipulations for What they were, not accidental circumstances, but carefully orchestrated opportunities. The machinery breakdown might have been genuine, but Nathaniel's suggestion that Rose accompany him to the mill while William worked was clearly premeditated. As evening approached, and William departed for the main sawmill with his tools and repair manuals, Rose found herself alone with Nathaniel for the first time since their ride to the timber camp. The house felt different without William's presence, larger, somehow, and charged with possibilities that had previously existed only in stolen glances and carefully ambiguous conversations. "Shall we go to the mill?" Nathaniel asked as they stood together in the front hallway. Rose met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine whether they continued their elaborate pretense of proper behavior or acknowledged the attraction that had been building between them for weeks. "I'd rather not," she said quietly. Nathaniel smiled, and in that smile, Rose saw both promise and warning. They had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The mill visit that never happened marked the beginning of what both Rose and Nathaniel would later remember as the most intoxicating and dangerous month of their lives. Instead of touring sawmill operations, they spent that October evening walking through the darkened gardens behind the Decker mansion, talking with the intensity of people discovering fundamental truths about themselves and each other. Paused beside the fountain at the garden center. "I understand the difference between affection and passion. Offers you one, I could offer you the other." Rose felt her pulse quicken at his directness. "William is your son." "Yes, he is. And that makes what I'm feeling both impossible and inevitable." They stood close enough in the moonlight that Rose could see the silver threading through Nathaniel's dark hair, could observe the way his jaw tightened as he struggled with emotions that clearly surprised him with their intensity. Was a man who had built an empire through careful planning and calculated decisions, yet he was confessing to desires that defied all logic and propriety. "What are you suggesting?" Rose asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that some hungers are too powerful to ignore, regardless of their inconvenience." Rose turned away, needing space to think clearly. "And William will survive disappointment. He survived it before." The callousness of this statement should have horrified Rose, but instead she found herself considering its practical implications. In Boston she had been nobody, an Irish immigrant girl whose best hope was marriage to a dock worker or factory foreman who might provide basic security. In exchange for housekeeping and childbearing services, William offered escape from that destiny. But Nathaniel offered something far more intoxicating, the opportunity to share real power, to help shape a business empire that would outlast both their lives. "I need time to think," she said. Finally, Nathaniel accepted this with the patience of a man confident in his ultimate victory. "Of course, but don't wait too long. Some opportunities don't present themselves twice." Morning brought William's effusive apologies for the previous evening's disappointment, along with promises that such business emergencies would never again interfere with their personal time. He had worked until nearly dawn, completing the machinery repairs, and his exhaustion made him even more solicitous than usual about Rose's comfort and happiness. "Did Father give you an interesting tour of the mill?" he asked over breakfast, clearly hoping that Nathaniel's attention had compensated for his own absence. "We didn't actually visit the mill," Rose replied carefully. "Your father felt it would be inappropriate for a lady to observe industrial operations after dark." William accepted this explanation without question, his relief evident. He had been struggling with guilt about leaving Rose alone on what was supposed to be their special evening, and learning that she had been properly chaperoned eased his conscience considerably. What William didn't notice was the brief look that passed between Rose and Nathaniel as she delivered this careful version of the truth. It was the first of many small lies they would tell together, the beginning of a conspiracy that would gradually expand to encompass much larger deceptions. Over the following days, Nathaniel found increasingly creative reasons to spend time alone with Rose. A potential property purchase required someone with feminine perspective to evaluate the condition of the house and outbuildings. A meeting with New Orleans lumber buyers needed social support that only a refined lady could provide. Equipment. Suppliers visiting from Chicago expected to be entertained with the kind of cultivated conversation that business dinners demanded. William not only approved of these activities, but actively encouraged them. Willingness to include Rose in business matters seemed to demonstrate acceptance of her as a future family member, while Rose's eagerness to participate suggested genuine interest in understanding the source of their prosperity. That his fiancée and his father seemed to enjoy each other's company struck William as evidence of his good fortune rather than cause for concern. But Fortune Smith's more observant residents began to notice patterns that William missed entirely. Mrs. Adelaide Forrester, whose Garrison Avenue mansion provided an excellent view of the Decker property, observed that Nathaniel's business carriages seemed to make unusually frequent visits to his own home during midday hours when William was occupied at the sawmill. She also noted that these visits often lasted several hours longer than any conceivable business matter would require. Similarly, Thomas Brennan, who managed the River District's largest hotel, began receiving unusual requests from Nathaniel for private dining rooms and discreet accommodations for out-of-town business associates who bore striking resemblances to Rose Sullivan. When Brennan mentioned these arrangements to his wife during their own evening conversations, she pointed out that respectable businessmen generally conducted such meetings in their offices rather than hotel rooms. Most telling of all, Father Michael O'Brien, the Irish Catholic priest who was scheduled to perform Rose and William's wedding ceremony, found himself increasingly troubled by his conversations with the bride-to-be. He met with Rose to discuss the spiritual dimensions of Catholic marriage. He detected an enthusiasm that seemed disconnected from any mention of her intended husband. She spoke passionately about building something lasting and meaningful, about finding purpose beyond mere survival, about the satisfaction of exercising real influence in the world, but never specifically about her love for William or her excitement about their future together. Marriage is a sacrament, Father O'Brien reminded her during one such conversation, not a business partnership. Of course, Rose agreed quickly, but her response carried the mechanical quality of someone reciting expected words rather than expressing genuine conviction. These scattered observations might have remained merely gossip, except for the intervention of Margaret Henley, Fort Smith's most notorious busybody and the wife of the town's second-largest lumber dealer. Margaret had built her social position on an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone else's business, and she possessed an instinct for scandal that had exposed 3 different adultery cases and 2 embezzlement schemes over the past 5 years. Margaret's suspicions were first aroused when she observed Nathaniel and Rose entering Murphy's Tavern together on a Tuesday afternoon when William was known to be conducting business in Van Buren. Murphy's served the rougher element of Fort Smith's population, river workers, loggers, and visiting cattle drivers who preferred strong whiskey to polite conversation. No respectable businessman would take his son's fiancée to such an establishment unless he had compelling reasons for avoiding more conventional meeting places. Intrigued, Margaret began conducting her own informal investigation. She enlisted her Irish housemaid, Colleen Ali, to engage Rose in conversations about wedding preparations and married life. She convinced her husband to invite Nathaniel to their weekly poker game, hoping that alcohol might loosen his tongue about his relationship with his future daughter-in-law. She even began timing her afternoon walks to coincide with the comings and goings at the Decker mansion. What Margaret discovered confirmed her worst suspicions, and exceeded her most scandalous expectations. Through careful observation and strategic questioning, she learned that Nathaniel and Rose had been meeting privately for weeks, that their conversations went far beyond appropriate business discussions, and that both seemed to be struggling with emotions that had nothing to do with proper family relationships. More disturbing still, Margaret began to notice changes in William's behavior that suggested he might be suffering from some form of illness. He appeared increasingly tired during social gatherings, complained frequently of headaches and stomach problems, and seemed to have lost the modest self-confidence he had previously displayed in business matters. When Margaret mentioned these observations to her husband, he confirmed that William's performance at work had become erratic and unreliable. Covering for him, Harold Henley reported after his poker evening with the lumber baron, claims the boy's been working too hard and needs rest before the wedding. But the mill supervisors tell a different story. They say William can barely make it through a full day without needing to lie down. Margaret's instincts, sharpened by years of exposing other people's secrets, told her that William's declining health was somehow connected to his father's inappropriate relationship with his fiancée. Presence of secrets that were eating away at the normal functioning of the Decker household. Decisive action came on October 17th, just 3 days before the scheduled wedding ceremony. October 17, 1888, dawned grey and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that turned Fort Smith's unpaved streets into rivers of mud and kept respectable citizens indoors with their fires burning high. It was weather that invited confidences and provided cover for activities that might seem suspicious under clearer skies. William had been scheduled to travel to Little Rock that morning to finalize arrangements with a new timber buyer, but he complained of such severe stomach cramping that he could barely stand upright. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the family physician, prescribed bed rest and a diet of bland foods, suggesting that the stress of approaching marriage might be affecting William's digestive system. Young men often experienced nervous symptoms before their wedding day. Dr. Hayes assured Nathaniel as they spoke privately in the mansion's front parlor. A few days of rest should restore his equilibrium. Nathaniel accepted this diagnosis with apparent concern for his son's welfare. But Rose noticed something in his expression that the doctor missed entirely, a flicker of satisfaction that suggested William's illness might not be entirely unwelcome. With William confined to his bed and the Little Rock business trip requiring immediate attention, Nathaniel announced that he would handle the timber negotiations personally. The trip would require 2 days, possibly 3 if the buyers proved difficult, which meant he would be absent for the wedding's final preparations. Perhaps Rose should accompany me, Nathaniel suggested with careful casualness. She's expressed such interest in learning about our business operations, and these negotiations could provide valuable education about contract terms and pricing strategies. Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. An excellent idea. Miss Sullivan's presence would lend a civilizing influence to what can be rather rough business discussions. Rose found herself agreeing to the trip with an enthusiasm that should have aroused suspicion, but that everyone interpreted as eagerness to support the family business. In truth, she recognized the proposal for what it was, an opportunity for her and Nathaniel to spend extended time together, away from the constraints and observations of Fort Smith society. But Margaret Henley, watching from her window as the Decker carriage departed for the railroad station, understood exactly what she was witnessing. Here was a father and his son's fiancée traveling unchaperoned to another city just days before a wedding that had already generated whispers about inappropriate relationships and suspicious behavior. Was swift and decisive. She sent her most trusted servant to the telegraph office with urgent messages to 3 of her most reliable correspondents in Little Rock, society ladies whose networks of information rivaled her own. and who could be counted upon to observe and report on any unusual activities involving visiting timber merchants and their female companions. More importantly, Margaret decided to pay a social call on the ailing William Decker. Armed with a basket of medicinal herbs and her most concerned maternal expression, she arrived at the Decker mansion within hours of Nathaniel and Rose's departure. William, grateful for any distraction from his physical discomfort, welcomed Margaret's visit with pathetic eagerness. Terrible, pale, thin, and trembling slightly, even beneath heavy blankets. His eyes, normally bright with gentle intelligence, appeared dull and unfocused. "You, poor dear," Margaret cooped, settling herself beside his bed with the practiced efficiency of a woman experienced in extracting information from vulnerable targets. "Dr. Hayes says it's just nerves, but you look positively ill. Have you been eating properly?" William admitted that his appetite had been poor for several weeks, that food seemed to taste strange, and that even his favorite dishes left him feeling nauseated. He attributed these symptoms to wedding anxiety and the pressure of increased business responsibilities, but Margaret's experienced eye detected signs that suggested something far more sinister. She had seen similar symptoms before, during the winter of 1885, when old Samuel Reeves had slowly wasted away from what his family believed was a lingering fever, but what Margaret's suspicious nature had correctly identified as arsenic poisoning administered by his young wife. The gradual weight loss, the persistent stomach problems, the trembling hands and dulled reflexes, all pointed to systematic poisoning rather than simple nervousness. "Tell me about your meals," Margaret prompted gently. "Are you eating the same foods as your father and Miss Sullivan?" William considered this question with the deliberate care of someone whose thinking had become slow and labored. "His meals at the hotel when he has business meetings. And Rose has been dining with clients quite frequently, learning about the business." "You understand." Margaret understood perfectly. If her suspicions were correct, Nathaniel and Rose had been carefully ensuring that William consumed poisoned food while they remained safely unaffected. The timing was perfect. Gradual poisoning that would culminate in death just before or just after the wedding, leaving the grieving father to comfort his son's bereaved fiancée. "Who prepares your food, dear?" Margaret asked. "Mrs. Patterson, our cook, usually, though father sometimes brings me special tonics from Dr. Hayes to help with my digestion, and Rose has been so thoughtful. She often brings me tea or broth when I'm feeling poorly." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Here was evidence of opportunity and method, delivered with the innocent trust of a victim who had no idea that his own family was slowly murdering him. But Margaret was too experienced in the art of scandal to reveal her suspicions prematurely. Instead, she spent the remainder of her visit gathering more information about the household routines, the timing of William's symptoms, and the precise nature of his relationship with his father and fiancée. Confirmed her worst fears. William's illness had begun shortly after Rose's arrival in Fort Smith. The symptoms had grown progressively worse during the weeks when Nathaniel and Rose were spending increasing amounts of time together. Most damning of all, William's condition seemed to improve slightly whenever his father traveled on business, only to deteriorate again upon Nathaniel's return. By the time Margaret left the Decker mansion, she possessed enough circumstantial evidence to destroy 3 lives with a single, well-placed conversation. But she also understood that accusations of murder required more than suspicion, particularly when they involved Fort Smith's most powerful businessman and his son's Irish fiancée. Little Rock, Nathaniel, and Rose were discovering that physical distance from their complicated situation only intensified their emotional connection. The train journey had provided hours of private conversation. Accommodations had eliminated the need for careful chaperoning, and the business meetings had demonstrated their intellectual compatibility in ways that purely social interactions never could. "We work well together," Nathaniel observed as they reviewed contract terms in his hotel suite. "After a successful day of negotiations, you understand the financial implications of these deals better than William ever has." Wine and the intoxicating sense of being valued for her intelligence rather than merely her potential as a wife. Mother found herself speaking more freely than she ever had before. "Doesn't really want to understand," she said. "He performs his duties, but he has no passion for the work itself. Rather read poetry than build an empire. And you, what would you rather do?" Rose met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine whether they continued their elaborate pretense or acknowledged the desires that had been building between them for weeks. "I'd rather build an empire," she said, quietly. Nathaniel's response came not in words but in actions that would bind them together in conspiracy and passion. When he kissed her, Rose felt every carefully constructed barrier between duty and desire crumble away, responded with equal intensity. They both understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. What followed was a night of physical intimacy that revealed the true depth of their emotional connection. But it was also a night of planning, of whispered conversations about futures that could only be achieved through the elimination of inconvenient obstacles. "William's illness isn't improving," Nathaniel said as they lay together in the pre-dawn darkness. "Hayes is concerned that it might be something more serious than simple nervous exhaustion." Rose understood immediately what he was suggesting. How serious, potentially fatal, if it continues to progress. They spoke in euphemisms and implications, never stating their intentions directly, but both understood perfectly what was being discussed. William's death would solve their problems completely, freeing Rose from an unwanted marriage, while providing Nathaniel with both the woman he desired and a plausible explanation for their subsequent union. "Such things happen," Rose murmured. "Young men with weak constitutions sometimes succumb to illnesses that stronger people survive." "Exactly. And a grieving father might naturally offer protection to his son's bereaved fiancé. But their careful planning faced an unexpected complication when they returned to Fort Smith the next evening. Margaret Henley was waiting for them at the railroad station, her presence clearly not coincidental. "Mr. Decker," she called out as they disembarked from the Little Rock train. "I do hope your business went well. Poor William has been quite worried about your absence." Margaret's tone was perfectly polite, but her eyes conveyed a message that made both Nathaniel and Rose understand that their secret was no longer entirely secret. Here was a woman who suspected something, who had been watching and waiting and drawing conclusions that could prove extremely dangerous. "Mrs. Henley," Nathaniel replied with careful courtesy. "How thoughtful of you to inquire about our trip. William's condition hasn't worsened in our absence." "Oh, quite the contrary. Seemed much improved this afternoon, almost as if the change in his routine had been beneficial." The implication was clear. Margaret had not only observed William's illness, but had noticed its relationship to his father's presence. She was sending a warning that she understood exactly what was happening and would be watching for any further developments. As they rode home through the dark streets of Fort Smith, Rose and Nathaniel understood that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Margaret Henley's suspicions meant that any further deterioration in William's health would be scrutinized with uncomfortable intensity. They needed to act quickly, decisively, and in a way that would deflect suspicion rather than attract it. The solution, when it came to them, was brilliantly simple and utterly ruthless. The morning of October 19th, 1888, brought crisp autumn weather, perfect for what would become the final hunt of William Decker's life. announced at breakfast that he had arranged a farewell hunting expedition for his son and several close friends. Traditional bachelor party to celebrate William's last day as an unmarried man. William, who had seemed somewhat improved since his father's return from Little Rock, greeted this proposal with genuine enthusiasm. He had always enjoyed hunting despite his generally gentle nature, and the prospect of spending time outdoors with friends appealed to him far more than the elaborate bachelor dinner his father had originally planned. "Excellent idea," William said, his color better than it had been in weeks. "I could use some fresh air and exercise before tomorrow's ceremony." Rose expressed appropriate disappointment at being excluded from the masculine festivities, but privately, she understood that this hunting trip represented the culmination of everything she and Nathaniel had been planning. They had discussed the general outlines during their time in Little Rock, but now she watched Nathaniel implement the specific details with an efficiency that both impressed and terrified her. Includes 6 men: William Nathaniel Harold Henley, Margaret's husband, Thomas Brennan from the hotel, Dr. Samuel Hayes, and James Crawford, the mill's chief supervisor. All were experienced hunters, familiar with the wooded hills east of Fort Smith, and all possessed sufficient social standing that their testimony about any unfortunate accidents would be accepted, without question. But Rose noticed details that the other participants missed entirely. Nathaniel selected the hunting location, a remote section of timberland where fallen logs and dense underbrush would make movement difficult and visibility limited. He insisted on bringing specific rifles, claiming that certain weapons were better suited to deer hunting in heavy cover. He even suggested the hunting formation, positioning himself and William in a way that would create opportunity for what he euphemistically called hunting mishaps. "Will you be all right alone for the day?" William asked Rose as the hunting party prepared to depart. "I know it's not ideal leaving you by yourself the day before our wedding." Rose assured him that she would use the time productively, perhaps visiting with some of the other ladies to discuss final wedding preparations. What she didn't mention was that she had already arranged to spend the afternoon with Margaret Henley, not from any desire for the woman's company, but because she understood the importance of establishing an alibi that would place her far from the scene of the planned accident. The hunting party departed at dawn, their rifles and ammunition loaded into a wagon that would carry them to the remote timber tract where Nathaniel claimed to have seen signs of a large buck during his recent business travels. The men were in high spirits, joking about William's nervousness and placing friendly wagers on who would bring down the finest deer. Dr. Hayes had brought a flask of excellent whiskey to celebrate any successful kills, while Harold Henley contributed cigars imported from Cuba for the same purpose. James Crawford, the most experienced hunter in the group, offered advice about tracking techniques and wine direction that would maximize their chances of success. Only Nathaniel remained focused on practical rather than social considerations, quietly noting terrain features, checking sight lines, and positioning the hunters in ways that would serve his purposes rather than theirs. The timber tract stretched across several hundred acres of rolling hills covered with oak, hickory, and pine trees. Fallen logs and the thick underbrush created a landscape where hunters could easily become separated from their companions, where the sound of gunshots would echo confusingly among the trees, and where a man might lie wounded for hours before being discovered. Nathaniel suggested that they spread out in a loose line, maintaining visual contact when possible, but allowing each hunter freedom to pursue promising tracks. This formation would enable them to cover more ground while reducing the likelihood of accidental shootings, a precaution that everyone applauded as evidence of Nathaniel's thoughtful leadership. What the other hunters didn't realize was that this formation also created multiple opportunities for isolated encounters between father and son, moments when a single gunshot might be attributed to anyone in the party, and when the absence of witnesses would allow for creative explanations of tragic accidents. The morning passed quietly with occasional distant shots indicating that various hunters were engaging targets, but no calls of success to suggest that anyone had made a clean kill. Around midday, the party regrouped for lunch at a clearing beside a small creek, sharing sandwiches and coffee. While comparing notes about deer sign and promising locations, William seemed completely restored to health, his earlier symptoms apparently forgotten in the excitement of the hunt. With the other men about his impending marriage, accepted their teasing about losing his freedom with good humor, and demonstrated the kind of relaxed confidence that had been missing from his personality for weeks. Like a new man, Dr. Hayes observed approvingly. Nothing like fresh air and exercise to cure nervous exhaustion. Nathaniel agreed with apparent satisfaction, though Rose would have recognized the irony in his tone. William did indeed look like a new man, which made what was about to happen seem all the more tragic and unnecessary. After lunch, the hunters separated, again this time moving toward a section of the tract where Crawford claimed to have seen fresh deer tracks. Here was particularly challenging, with steep slopes and thick cover that would require careful movement to avoid falls or becoming lost. Nathaniel maneuvered himself into position approximately 50 yards behind William, close enough for an accurate shot, but far enough away to claim that he had been targeting a deer that appeared to move behind his son's position. The other hunters were spread across a wide area, their attention focused on their own tracking rather than on their companions' activities. 2:30 in the afternoon, a single rifle shot echoed through the Arkansas hills. When the other hunters converged on the sound, they found Nathaniel kneeling beside William's motionless body, hands covered with blood from futile attempts to stop the massive chest wound that had clearly proven instantly fatal. "I thought I saw a deer moving through the brush," Nathaniel gasped, his distress apparently genuine. "I took the shot before I saw that William was directly in the line of fire. Oh God, what have I done?" Physical evidence supported his account perfectly. William had been shot from behind with a heavy rifle at close range, the kind of wound that might result from a hunting accident in heavy cover. His position suggested that he had been moving away from his father's location, possibly pursuing deer tracks that had led him into the path of Nathaniel's intended shot. Dr. Hayes confirmed that death had been instantaneous, that no medical intervention could have saved William, even if help had arrived immediately. The other hunters, shocked by the tragedy, but familiar with hunting accidents, accepted Nathaniel's explanation without question. Such things happened, particularly when hunters pursued game in difficult terrain where visibility was limited. James Crawford, whose experience made him the group's acknowledged expert on hunting safety, examined the scene carefully and pronounced it a textbook example of the kind of accident that occurred when hunters failed to maintain proper awareness of their companions' locations. "No one's to blame," he declared solemnly. "These hills are treacherous, and deer can lead a man into dangerous positions before he realizes his mistake." But as they prepared William's body for transport back to Fort Smith, Harold Henley noticed something that troubled him deeply. The angle of the wound suggested that the shot had been fired from a position slightly above and behind William's location, exactly where Nathaniel claimed to have been standing, but the powder burns on William's clothing indicated that the rifle had been discharged from much closer range than 50 yards. Harold said nothing at the time, understanding that such observations would only add to Nathaniel's grief and guilt. Hills, he found himself wondering whether the hunting accident had been quite as accidental as it appeared. Meanwhile, in Fort Smith, Rose Sullivan was maintaining her carefully planned alibi by spending the afternoon in Margaret Henley's parlor, discussing wedding flowers and reception menus with apparent enthusiasm. When news of the hunting accident arrived via breathless messenger. Rose's response was perfectly calibrated. Shock, grief, and desperate concern for Nathaniel's emotional state. "Oh, the poor man," she sobbed. Convincingly, to lose his son in such a horrible way, and just hours before William's wedding, how will he ever forgive himself? Margaret Henley, however, was watching Rose's performance with the calculating gaze of a woman who had spent years studying human nature. While Rose's words expressed appropriate emotions, her eyes revealed something else entirely, a satisfaction that she was struggling to conceal behind tears that seemed somehow forced. As evening fell and the hunting party returned to Fort Smith with William's body, Margaret understood that she was witnessing the culmination of the most carefully planned murder in Sebastian County's history. But she also understood that proving such a crime would require evidence that no longer existed, witnesses who had already accepted the official version of events, and a community that would prefer to believe in tragic accidents rather than face the horror of premeditated murder. Funeral of William Decker on October 21, 1888, drew the largest crowd in Fort Smith's history. Mourners filled the Methodist church and spilled onto the surrounding streets, united in grief for a young man whose life had been cut short by what everyone accepted as a terrible hunting accident. Nathaniel, devastated by guilt and loss, could barely speak during the service. His obvious anguish convinced even skeptical observers that whatever mistakes he might have made in the woods, they had been the result of tragic miscalculation rather than deliberate intent. Collapsed during the graveside ceremony and had to be supported by friends, the last doubts about his innocence seemed to vanish. Rose Sullivan, dressed in mourning black and maintaining a dignified composure despite her obvious grief, received condolences as both the deceased's fiancé and his father's future responsibility. Several well-meaning ladies suggested that she might want to return to Boston, that remaining in Fort Smith would only prolong her sorrow, but Rose quietly indicated her intention to stay and help Nathaniel through his darkest hour. Couldn't abandon him now, she told Father O'Brien when he offered to arrange her transportation back to Massachusetts. William would have wanted me to care for his father. Troubled by aspects of the situation he couldn't quite articulate, accepted this explanation while making mental notes to observe the household dynamics more carefully in the coming weeks. Henley, watching these interactions with a cynicism born of experience, understood exactly what she was witnessing. Rose Sullivan had no intention of leaving Fort Smith, because Fort Smith represented everything she had ever wanted: wealth, social position, and partnership with a man powerful enough to reshape circumstances according to his desires. But Margaret also understood that accusation without proof would accomplish nothing except her own social destruction. Decker commanded too much respect and wielded too much influence for anyone to challenge his version of events without overwhelming evidence. And that evidence, if it had ever existed, now buried along with William in the Fort Smith cemetery. So Margaret chose a different strategy. Instead of confronting the conspirators directly, she began a patient campaign of observation and documentation, recording every interaction between Nathaniel and Rose, noting the timing of their eventual engagement, and gathering testimony from servants and employees who might have observed suspicious behavior during the weeks preceding William's death. Her instincts proved correct. By Christmas of 1888, Nathaniel and Rose were seen together frequently, their shared grief apparently creating a bond that transcended normal proprietary concerns. By Easter of 1889, rumors of an engagement were circulating throughout Fort Smith society, and in June of 1889, exactly 8 months after William's death, Nathaniel Decker married Rose Sullivan in a quiet ceremony that acknowledged their mutual loss, while celebrating their hope for future happiness. The marriage seemed to restore Nathaniel's spirits and provide Rose with the social position she had always craved. They worked together efficiently in managing the expanded lumber operations, traveled frequently to discuss business opportunities in other cities, and presented themselves as a couple, united by tragedy, but determined to build something meaningful from their shared experience of loss. But Margaret Henley's careful observations revealed details that others missed. The newlyweds displayed none of the tentative affection typical of couples brought together by circumstances. Instead, they interacted with the easy intimacy of people who had been lovers long before their marriage became socially acceptable. Conversations revealed shared references and private jokes that seemed to predate William's death by weeks or months. Significantly, Rose seemed to possess detailed knowledge of business operations that she could only have acquired through extended private instruction. She participated in contract negotiations with the confidence of someone who understood every aspect of the lumber trade, made strategic recommendations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of market conditions, and handled financial calculations with mathematical precision that suggested considerable experience with the company's books. When Margaret shared these observations with her husband, Harold confirmed that Rose's business acumen had indeed seemed remarkably advanced for someone who had supposedly learned about lumber operations only after her fiancé's death. Her questions during board meetings revealed understanding of concepts that typically required years of experience to master. It's as if she had been studying the business for months before William died. Observed uneasily, almost as if she had been preparing to take over his role in the company. Margaret nodded grimly. Here was evidence that the conspiracy between Nathaniel and Rose had been planned far in advance, that William's murder had been part of a larger strategy to eliminate an inconvenient obstacle to their personal and professional partnership. But evidence of planning, while morally damning, fell short of legal proof. Without witnesses to the actual crime, without physical evidence of premeditation, without testimony from the participants themselves, Margaret could do nothing except watch and wait for the conspirators to make mistakes that might expose their guilt. Those mistakes, when they came, proved more dramatic than Margaret had anticipated. In the summer of 1891, James Crawford, the mill supervisor who had pronounced William's death an accident, was found dead in his home under circumstances that initially appeared to be natural causes. Dr. Hayes attributed the death to heart failure, noting that Crawford had been complaining of chest pains for several weeks before his collapse. But Crawford's widow, Ellen, revealed to Margaret that her husband had been deeply troubled by something related to the Decker family in the weeks before his death. He had mentioned receiving visits from Nathaniel that seemed to upset him considerably, had talked about things that didn't add up regarding William's hunting accident, and had even suggested that they might need to leave Fort Smith if certain suspicions proved correct. Was frightened. Ellen confided to Margaret during a private conversation after the funeral, not of physical danger, but of something that could destroy our family's reputation and livelihood. Immediately what Crawford had discovered, and why his death had become necessary. As the hunting party's most experienced member, Crawford possessed the technical knowledge to recognize inconsistencies in the official version of William's death. If he had begun asking questions or demanding explanations, he could have unraveled the entire conspiracy. 6 months later, Dr. Samuel Hayes suffered what appeared to be a riding accident while making house calls in the rural areas outside Fort Smith. His horse, normally reliable and gentle, had reportedly been spooked by a snake and thrown the doctor against a tree with sufficient force to break his neck. But the timing of Hayes's death coming so soon after Crawford struck Margaret as suspiciously convenient. As the physician who had examined William's body and pronounced the death accidental, Hayes possessed medical knowledge that could potentially contradict the official findings if he ever chose to reconsider his initial conclusions. Margaret began to understand that she was witnessing not a single murder, but a systematic elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to Nathaniel and Rose's secret. The two deaths following Williams had been carefully disguised as natural causes and accidents, but they followed a pattern that could hardly be coincidental. When Harold Henley began expressing his own concerns about the unusual number of deaths among people connected to the Decker family, Margaret realized that her husband might be positioning himself to become the next victim of the conspiracy he was attempting to expose. Her fears proved prophetic. In March of 1892, Harold suffered what appeared to be a severe case of food poisoning after attending a business dinner hosted by Nathaniel and Rose. The symptoms initially seemed mild, stomach upset and fatigue that Dr. Hayes' replacement attributed to spoiled oysters served at the hotel restaurant, but Harold's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days, despite medical treatment that should have been effective for simple food poisoning. Margaret, remembering William's similar symptoms before his death, understood that she was watching her husband die from the same systematic poisoning that had weakened Nathaniel's son. However, Margaret was prepared. She had spent 4 years gathering evidence, documenting suspicious deaths, and building relationships with law enforcement officials outside Sebastian County, who might be willing to investigate crimes that local authorities preferred to ignore. When Harold died on March 15, 1892, Margaret Henley was ready to reveal everything she knew about the conspiracy that had claimed at least 4 lives and threatened to claim many more. She sat in the telegraph office preparing to send messages that would bring federal marshals to Fort Smith. Margaret realized that even her carefully gathered evidence might not be sufficient to convict 2 people who had demonstrated remarkable skill at eliminating witnesses and covering their tracks. The story of Nathaniel Decker and Rose Sullivan had already become part of Fort Smith folklore. Tale of love emerging from loss, of 2 people finding comfort in shared grief, and building something beautiful from the ashes of their mutual tragedy. The community had invested too much emotional energy in this romantic narrative to accept the possibility that it had been built on carefully planned murders and systematic deception. Margaret's telegrams went unanswered. The federal marshals found more pressing concerns elsewhere, and the deaths that had troubled her so deeply were officially forgotten, filed away in courthouse basement along with other unpleasant memories that Fort Smith preferred not to examine too closely. Nathaniel and Rose Decker continued to prosper, expanding their lumber empire across 3 states and establishing themselves as one of Arkansas's most influential families. They had 3 children together, built a magnificent mansion that dominated Fort Smith's skyline, and were remembered by subsequent generations as pioneers who had helped transform the Arkansas Territory into a thriving center of American commerce. Margaret Henley died in 1894, taking her suspicions to a grave located less than 50 yards from William Decker's final resting place. Her detailed journals, discovered decades later during renovation of the family home, provided the evidence that law enforcement had refused to pursue during her lifetime. But by then, Nathaniel and Rose were long dead themselves, their crimes buried beneath layers of community pride and historical romanticism that made objective investigation impossible. The truth about what really happened in those Arkansas hills remained hidden until 1987, when construction workers renovating the basement of the Sebastian County courthouse discovered a collection of documents that Margaret Henley had hidden behind a false wall. Meticulous records, combined with recently discovered letters between Nathaniel and Rose, finally revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed at least 5 lives and corrupted an entire community's understanding of justice. Reading Margaret's journals today, it's impossible not to admire her persistence in pursuing truth, despite overwhelming odds. Ignore the chilling efficiency with which Nathaniel and Rose eliminated every threat to their secret. transforming what should have been a simple murder investigation into a decades-long campaign of systematic elimination. The most disturbing aspect of their story may be how completely they succeeded in rewriting history according to their desires. For over a century, the people of Fort Smith remembered them not as criminals but as romantic figures who had found love in the aftermath of tragedy. Perhaps that's the most frightening lesson their story offers, that guilt and innocence, truth and fiction, love and murder can become hopelessly entangled when people possess sufficient intelligence, determination, and complete absence of moral restraint. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there might have been even darker secrets hidden in those Arkansas hills? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this chilling tale of forbidden love and calculated murder. If you enjoyed this story and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark tales from America's past. We'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another forgotten crime that time tried to bury.